Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we'll be doing the Season 7 episode ranking for MLP, Friendship is Magic. And Season 7 is kind of similar to Season 6 in a lot of ways, to where I feel like it's a largely consistent season with relatively few bad episodes. However, I also feel like it doesn't have too many standouts either that kind of makes it a bit overlooked in the eyes of a lot of people, but I don't think it's that bad of a season at the end of the day. Now, this season does only have one two-parter, which does elevate the episode count here to 25 instead of the 24 that most seasons have, so that makes this count a little bit weird, but nothing too crazy at the end of the day. But as I just said, there are 25 episodes to get into here, with there only being one two-parter. And let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the list. So starting off at number 25, the worst episode of Season 7 is one that is largely broken. However, it's not necessarily one that I find that insufferable to watch, but there are still plenty of things to pick apart with it. But here we have Honest Apple, and this is actually something that Mr. Enter covered not too long ago, despite him not really covering MLP much these days. This episode clearly did something that made him want to cover it, but I mean, it is what it is. But honestly, this episode isn't necessarily the worst of the entire series, in my opinion. I definitely feel like there are plenty of worse episodes to discuss here, but it's still one that is largely broken, largely based around its premise, where obviously the issues are apparent. I mean, Rarity goes to Applejack of all people to judge a fashion show, and considering the fact that Applejack has stated multiple times throughout the series that she doesn't really view fashion the same way that Rarity does, literally going back to Look Before You Sleep in season 1, but other episodes after that also mention that fact. I mean, Rarity's justification for Applejack being a judge here is relatively flimsy, with her saying that Applejack is pretty honest, but obviously this comes back to bite her when Applejack's honesty leads to her trashing all the contestants in the show. And I understand why, like, they want to limit it to just three, but still, I still feel like the fact that they only had three contestants in this entire contest was a bit silly at the end of the day, but it is what it is. But it literally boils down to Rarity asking Applejack to do something. Applejack does exactly what she intended her to do, and then she gets mad at Applejack because she did what she asked her to do, which was to be honest. And Rarity should have known this was going to happen, considering that Applejack is obviously on the more practical side and was probably more likely to judge a lot of these contestants rather negatively. But yet Applejack is the one who has to learn a lesson here when Rarity literally summons her to Strawberry Sunrise's house, where she literally berates apples at every opportunity. Applejack gets upset, and then she realizes, oh hey, maybe I shouldn't be so brutally honest all the time, even though that's precisely the attribute that Rarity thought of when she asked me to be a judge for this fashion show in the first place. So literally, it is an episode that involves Rarity getting mad at Applejack for doing what she intended her to do, and then Applejack having to learn a lesson of brutal honesty not always being the best solution, despite multiple other episodes in the series saying that honesty is the best policy at the end of the day. So for Applejack to learn this lesson here for seemingly no reason, and for reasons that involve Rarity, like just not understanding what she was getting herself into, was pretty ridiculous at the end of the day. And obviously that leads to the story falling apart at the seams. So on the whole, that's not great about this episode. Now, I will say that the actual contestant characters themselves are somewhat interesting. I mean, particularly Lily Lays, who does kind of remind me of Lenny from Loud House, but that's just me. But on the whole, this episode is just completely broken in terms of its story, in terms of its message, so I can't give it too much credit, and obviously that is a big reason why it is here at the bottom. However, when we're comparing it to some of the worst episodes in the show, I feel like it is slightly more enjoyable, if I'm being perfectly honest, but it's those flaws that are just too apparent for me to ignore. So because of that, I do have it here at number 25. Now we're moving on to number 24, and this episode was pretty boring for the most part and had some pretty jarring moments along the way, but it does have a few moments that make me put it above Honest Apple. But here we have Hard to Say Anything, And this episode was just kind of weird for the most part, where a lot of it involves Big Mac getting into it with this Justin Bieber style pony as he's trying to woo Sugar Belle throughout a lot of it. And a lot of it is just pretty awkward for the most part and not really entertaining in my personal opinion. I just didn't care too much for the actual story. And a lot of it felt pretty predictable as well, where the CMC was giving Big Mac all this advice on how to impress Sugar Belle, only for it to completely backfire. And we get to that song where he tries singing her a song, but then the Justin Bieber pony also sings a song. Now, my favorite moment of the episode actually comes during the song when Big Mac is trying to rhyme blue with blue, and he literally says that Sugar Belle's eyes are blue when they're obviously not blue. And then Apple Bloom puts some blue lenses over Sugar Belle's eyes, and she just gives her this glare. I mean, that is something, but when that's the highlight of your episode, I mean, what are you doing? And then obviously she gets mad at them. Like Big Mac is pretty defeated, but then he's able to pull off this whole scheme where he's able to distract Sugar Belle long enough to fix her table. But in doing so, we have Scootaloo like putting off this whole disguise and then breaking her bag in the process just to buy some time. But at the end of the day, this episode is just largely boring in my personal opinion. And while it's not the worst episode by any means, I can't give it too much credit. So I do have to leave it here at number 24. Now we're moving on to number 23, and we have possibly the most controversial episode of the season. And I know in the past when I talked about some of these controversial episodes that I generally tend to stick to the middle. However, in this case, I can't justify it too much. But here we have Fame and Misfortune. And again, we have another episode that Mr. Enter covered on his channel. And I actually kind of agree with Mr. Enter in terms of this episode not being too great. Now, obviously, we've had episodes like this before, like Slice of Life and Stranger Than Fanfiction, that do delve a bit more into the fandom aspects of the show. And for the most part, I just kind of been on the fence about it to where I feel like it's not inherently bad, but it just comes down to the execution. But I feel like in this episode, it's just a bit too on the nose, in my personal opinion. I mean, we literally have the main six publishing a book that is essentially supposed to be a representation of the show itself. I mean, it's literally them publishing all the lessons that they learned from previous episodes and then selling it to the general public. They're literally representing the show here. In the fandom that springs up from this book is literally meant to represent the brony fandom on the whole. And then we literally see the other ponies literally harass the main six more or less and bring up all the criticisms that people like to bring up with the show generally, like Fluttershy not having any character development, for instance. And again, I feel like this is just a bit too on the nose, and a lot of it does seem to not be super creative at the end of the day. This definitely felt more like an outlet for the writers to express towards some of the more ridiculous things that the fandom has done, more so than anything else. And again, I know that other episodes of the show have gone into similar territory before, but I feel like this episode particularly just really doubles down on it and goes a bit too far, in my personal opinion. And then the song Flawless is, well, far from flawless. I mean, wasn't really a huge fan of that song either. And yes, while it does have a bit of an uplifting ending where we see some little fillies like enjoying the book for what it is and not being terrible fans, I mean, at the end of the day, the message is largely clear to me, as most of the fandom is just these rabid, critical ponies that don't really care about the merits of it and instead allow their criticisms to really cloud a lot of the way in which they perceive the property in question. So I feel like at the end of the day, it is a bit too on the nose for me, and a big reason that it falls here to number 23. Now we're moving on to number 22, and I know there are people who like this episode quite a bit, but I also know plenty of other people who are completely soured out on this episode. And given its placement on this list, I am more in the latter category. However, even then, I feel like this episode still has some merit to it. But here we have Parental Gliding. And for me, I feel like a lot of your enjoyment with this episode is going to come down to how you see Rainbow Dash's parents here and whether they're likable or whether they're a bit too much. And obviously, I lean towards them being a bit too much here. obviously they're pretty embarrassing for Rainbow Dash on the whole, and it becomes pretty evident early on just why she has distanced herself so much from them. And then we get to the scene where Rainbow Dash finally gets a bit too much of them and literally just chews them out. And we have that moment where they're like, "Oh, great job, Rainbow Dash, for yelling at us. No one can make you feel more worthless than you can." And then Scootaloo also chews her out as well. And then through that, Rainbow Dash has to learn that her parents were a big part of who she is. And obviously, she didn't always do so well at flying, and how their encouragement is what helped her to succeed. And to me, I feel like a lot of that just felt a little weird at the end of the day. Like, I get the overall message that they're going for, that you shouldn't take your parents for granted and that they'll always be one of your biggest supports in your life, generally speaking. But I also think they go pretty far, and to the point where they could have gotten someone hurt, or they could have gotten Rainbow Dash in trouble at her job. I felt like there was definitely a balance that could have been struck there, and I feel like they largely kind of messed it up to a degree. Now, I will say there are still some positives to this episode. Like, I think one of the big ones is Scootaloo's involvement here, where Scootaloo really looks up to Rainbow Dash's parents for a lot of it. And considering the context that Scootaloo's parents are largely absent from her life, I mean, it's sort of interesting to see how she connects with them and really looks to them as her own second set of parents. And it's pretty understandable when she sees Rainbow Dash taking them for granted, that she in turn like tells Rainbow Dash that she probably should appreciate them a little bit more, as not everyone is fortunate enough to have parents that are willing to go so far out of their way to support them. So I do kind of find that aspect to be interesting, but still at the end of the day, I did find myself finding like the parents should have gotten a bit more accountability, and that maybe they should have learned that there are better ways to express their support than to just go over the top and really risk embarrassing everyone involved. So I do think that is largely a knock to the episode, and the fact that the episode largely presents Rainbow Dash as being in the wrong here without too much nuance is largely a problem for it at the end of the day, and a big reason that it is this low on the list. However, I still do get enough enjoyment from it that I can't say it's one of the worst episodes per se, but it's all those things that do lead me to put it here at number 22. Now we're moving on to number 21, and I'm sure some people will think this episode is a bit low. However, I'm not a huge fan of this episode, but here we have a Flurry of Emotions. And to me, this episode is a couple things. One, I think a lot of it is pretty boring in that a lot of it does focus on Twilight babysitting Flurry Heart while she's just trying to go about her day. I mean, that by itself is not the most interesting story. But then you have the side plot of Cadence and Shining Armor going to see their weird artist display here, and a lot of it seems to be kind of weird. Like, I guess they're kind of poking fun at the postmodern art movement to a degree, but even then, I didn't find that overly interesting. And I feel like a lot of the gags involved this guy feeling like, oh, this can here is a display of art, or this weird scribble has a lot of meaning to it. And then all the while we see Cadence and Shining Armor slowly being like, oh, we miss Flurry Heart, we need to see her again. So I did find that a bit weird. And also, I'm not entirely sure where they were going with for the message for a lot of it, where it seems like a lot of the message seems to be that Twilight should have made time for Flurry Heart and that she shouldn't have taken the responsibility if she was going to be so busy. However, I didn't really get that too great of a sense from it for a lot of it, where I felt like Twilight was mostly doing an adequate job considering all of her responsibilities. But then obviously Flurry Heart ended up causing a lot of trouble with her feeling like she was being ignored. And then we get to the climax where Twilight gets a bit too much of it and actually yells at Flurry Heart to put everyone down. And from that, Flurry Heart gets pretty sad and gets scared of Twilight, and then Twilight immediately forgives her. I always found that scene to be kind of weird in a lot of ways. Like, for one, I don't think Twilight was even that harsh to Flurry Heart. I felt like she was being relatively reasonable, where she says, Flurry Heart, that was very, very bad. And then Flurry Heart immediately bursts into tears, and that seemed to be the extent of it. And I felt like the reaction Twilight got out of that was a bit too much, where she compares that rarely measured response to her coming off as this big scary bear. And considering the fact that Flurry Heart did cause all this trouble by putting all these sick ponies into danger, I did feel like it was justified even to a degree. But still, to see her overreact and be so quick to forgive Flurry Heart and to apologize for everything was kind of jarring for me at the end of the day. And like I said, the story itself isn't too interesting. I didn't feel like there were too many interesting stuff going on. I don't feel like there were a ton of funny jokes. And in general, I did find parts of the episode pretty boring. But at the end of the day, I can't say that this is the worst episode of the season, as, yeah, despite there being some weird quirks to this episode, I don't feel like it's rises to the level of certain other episodes we already talked about. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 21. Now we're moving on to number 20, and I'm actually a little surprised this episode is as high as it is, as I feel like every time I think about this episode, it's never really seen that positively in my estimation. But when comparing it to the episodes we already talked about, I feel like it's less technically flawed and has a bit more enjoyable moments. But here we have Secrets and Pies. And I feel like for me, the main thing that I look to is the ending, where obviously Rainbow Dash has realized that she has messed up by lying to Pinkie all these years about her pies. And her solution to make up for it is to cobble together this monstrosity of a pie that's made out of literal garbage and concrete, and then say that to Pinkie that she's going to eat it all in front of her. And I always found that to be kind of weird because it sort of suggests that Pinkie's pies are so disgusting that Rainbow Dash would rather eat literal garbage than even take a single bite of Pinkie's pies. Like, I feel like it would have been a lot more reasonable if Rainbow Dash told Pinkie to whip up this pie on the spot and then say that she's going to eat it all in front of her. But then after Pinkie realizes how much effort and how much trouble that Rainbow Dash is going through, that Pinkie realizes that it's a bit too much for her to go through, that it's not worth it to put Rainbow Dash through all this stress, and then come to terms with the fact that, you know, there's just some things that you don't like. So I feel like that would have been a bit more reasonable, but it could also just be my weird brain going on saying that, oh, Rainbow Dash is going to eat this disgusting concoction over taking a single bite of Pinkie's pies that she put all this time and effort into. So I did find that a bit strange. But obviously, taking that out, this episode is largely your standard honesty is the best policy message here. And it's not great. I mean, the fact that Rainbow Dash puts Pinkie through all this torture when it's so clear that Pinkie just wants the truth and she just wants the satisfaction of seeing Rainbow Dash taking a single bite of her pies, only for Rainbow Dash to come up with all these weird distractions and all these weird distractions in order to avoid taking that bite and then throwing it away at the first opportunity that Pinkie isn't looking. So I do find that aspect of the episode to not be the best. However, the main reason I have this episode as high as it is I do kind of enjoy the side plot of Pinkie putting together like this fact that Rainbow Dash isn't eating the pies. And we do see some fantasies of Rainbow Dash using her laser eyes in order to avoid eating the pies. And we get that scene where Pinkie confronts Rainbow about not liking the pies, which I do find a bit cathartic at the end of the day, considering all the suffering that Pinkie went through when Rainbow Dash was just so clearly ignoring that. So that is something at least. But still, I feel like there's enough weird stuff working against it, but also the fact that this episode isn't even that exceptional in terms of its message, that does cause it to fall a decent amount. But I feel like there's enough merit with this episode to where I can't have it at the very, very bottom. So because of that, I do have it here at number 20. Now we're moving on to number 19, and we have an episode that is probably a bit less enjoyable for me to watch than something like Secrets and Pies, but I do have it a bit above it. But here we have Once Upon a Zeppelin. And for me, I feel like a lot of this episode does fall into certain tropes that just aren't fun for me to watch. I mean, it's pretty clear from early on that Twilight is looking forward to getting a break and just spending time with her family, but then it's just roped into doing all this stuff for Iron Will. And you had the predictable stuff at the beginning with her saying, oh, I want to do this one specific thing. And then obviously we have her getting off her duties just to barely miss the thing, which in this case is to see the Northern Stars. And that's not really fun for me to watch. I mean, and it's not fun in this episode either. And then this leads to Twilight giving her big rant where she says, "Oh, yeah, the cruise ponies are happy. My family's happy. Even Iron Will is happy. You know who isn't happy? Me." And then she steps on Star Trekker's hoof, and then he cries, and then she's like, "I'm sorry, but maybe that wouldn't have happened if you weren't practically standing on my tail. Not even my real family stands so close." And I did find that moment to be pretty amusing, like Twilight's just big explosion there. But the lead up to it of just watching her go through all these chores and her not being happy and missing out on all these memories, like it just doesn't sit right with me. And then there's obviously Star Trekker, who I know there are people who don't like Star Trekker, as he's clearly supposed to be this representation of this creepy fan of Twilight. But honestly, I don't mind him that much and I actually kind of relate to him. I mean, not in the creepiness aspect, but more so the social awkwardness perspective, where he's so clearly excited to see Twilight and he's trying to communicate himself properly, but it's just so clumsy and awkward that he just puts her off to a large degree. So I do find that interesting and I actually kind of like Star Trekker because of that. But like I said, the actual episode itself isn't the most fun to watch, although it does have some interesting nuggets, like again, Star Trekker, also learning more about Twilight's parents, particularly Twilight Velvet, and how she's a bit of a thrill seeker. And then this episode does have a nice enough conclusion where she tells the cruise ponies that she just wants to spend time with her family and they understand. And again, they're largely on her side and they're being good sports about it. So, kind of a contrast to Fame and Misfortune to a lot of degree. But it's the fact that this episode is largely not that great to watch. It actually kind of reminds me a bit of Three as a Crowd, where, again, a lot of it seems to be revolving around someone else making Twilight missing out on something she's enjoying and then really festering on the fact that she's missing out on all this stuff. So I can't have this episode too high simply due to my lack of enjoyment of a lot of it, but there's enough nuggets here and there that I do enjoy that do lead me to have it here at number 19. Now we're moving on to number 18, and to be honest, I wasn't entirely sure what to do with this episode, as for the most part, I don't care too much for it, and there are still some weird things about it. However, I do feel like this episode has at least some merit, but here we have Not Asking for Trouble, and this is a Pinky Yak episode, and a lot of it does rectify some of the issues I had with Party Poot, where the Yaks were largely shown in the negative. I mean, at least here we get to see them in their home territory a bit more, and we do learn a bit more about their culture, namely the fact that they refuse to ask for help. And I do find that aspect to be a bit interesting. Now, it still has the similar issue from Party Poot, where they are still largely stubborn and how they would rather push others away than accept help per se. But then at the end of the episode, I mean, it turns out that they were willing to receive help, but they didn't want to ask for it, which was just really weird, in my opinion. As, yeah, I kind of get it in the sense that, you know, like they didn't want to admit to themselves that they needed help and to the point where they wanted to ask, but yet they still received the help that they got afterwards, and from someone like Pinky, who was making it so clear throughout the episode that she wanted them to ask for help and was so willing to provide the help, but it was because they were too proud to admit that they needed help. But then when they get the help, they feel like that Pinky understands them because she gave them help without asking for it. So I'm a little confused over what exactly they wanted or didn't want. I mean, it seems like they simply wanted to not admit to themselves that they needed help, but that's just a weird moral at the end of the day to teach. I mean, it would have been something if Pinky at least like taught them to ask for help per se, but I also understand their need to like reinforce the yak culture and really prop it up to a degree to where they didn't really learn the lesson, but it was more so them coming to appreciate the fact that Pinky is so caring for them that she wants to do what's in their best interest, and yet she understands them because she helped them but they didn't ask for it. So I do find that pretty confusing at the end of the day. And honestly, outside that, the episode itself isn't too interesting. I mean, a lot of it is simply Pinky just trying to get the Yaks to admit that they have a problem, but they just refuse at every opportunity. So I can't say that this episode is super interesting at the end of the day, but there's at least enough creativity with what they were going with that I can't have it super low. And plus, I can't say that I was not enjoying my time watching it. It's just more so that I feel like other episodes are more enjoyable. So I do have to leave this episode a bit on the lower side. But again, I do give it some creativity in terms of their expression of yak culture and their effort to make it seem a bit more legitimate than what it came across in Party Pooped. So I do have it here at number 18. Now we're moving on to number 17, and we're actually moving on to a string of episodes that I've already talked about in previous videos, so I'll try not to go too in depth on them this time, but obviously I do have to talk about them to various degrees. But at number 17, we have All Bottled Up. And admittedly, I think my opinion on this episode has gone up a bit over time to where I feel like before a lot of it was me not liking how Trixie was acting for a lot of it, and in turn just seeing Starlight getting a bit infuriated by her. And also, I didn't really like the whole side plot of the main six trying to get out of an escape room, and then they literally solve it before they can break the record, and they break out into song. But then by them breaking out into song, they end up wasting enough time to not have the record anymore. I find that whole side plot to be pretty confusing, and I'm not entirely sure what they were going for, other than to be a bit more quote unquote meta to a degree, but it just didn't really work out too much for me. But regarding the main story, I think my opinion of it has gone up a bit over time to where, yeah, it's still kind of annoying seeing Trixie making all these mistakes and sort of feeling along with Starlight the frustration there. However, I do give it a bit more credit in the sense that, well, one, it is supposed to be intentional. I mean, that is the message at the end of the day, that like Starlight is supposed to learn that's okay to vent her frustrations out in a productive way rather than just bottling everything up. But also the character aspect of Starlight being afraid to express her anger against Trixie because she worries that if she chews out Trixie too much, then Trixie will no longer want to be her friend. So I do appreciate that to a degree, and sort of seeing how Starlight is still struggling to accept the ideas of friendship. And then along with that, we have the scene where the bottle breaks and all Starlight's anger gets channeled into Bulk Biceps and Granny Smith. And then we see her venting all these things through those characters to Trixie. And then Trixie just thinking that that's what Granny Smith and Bulk Biceps thinks. Like when Granny Smith says, "You don't have to hark on about my past all the time." And then Trixie's like, "Oh, I didn't know you had a dark past, Granny Smith." And then Bulk Biceps literally destroys his fruit stand, and then he like realizes afterwards like that he broke it. He's like, "My cart," and then everyone's looking at him like obviously he works multiple jobs, and he says, "What? I wear multiple hats." So I did find that scene a bit amusing. So I do think this episode's a bit more enjoyable than I recall it being, and particularly the main plot is pretty good on its own. But it's just that side plot, which really does nothing for me at all, that does drag this episode down to a degree. And there were some weird things here and there that I'm not sure what the episode was going with there. And even with the message being intentional, like I still didn't enjoy too much of Trixie's antics. So at the end of the day, I do feel like this episode has some potential to go up on a list moving forward. But for now, I did decide to leave it here at number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we have another Starlight episode. And here we have Uncommon Bond. And I feel like this episode could have worked a bit better if it didn't feel so repetitive at points. Like, I feel like this episode had some promising ideas, like Starlight feeling like she has this great connection with Sunburst, only to find out later on that Sunburst has plenty of other interests that don't involve her, and she has to just sit there as Sunburst spends all this time with other people and connecting with them while she just couldn't care less about what they were doing. However, I do find a lot of that part of the episode to be kind of boring, where it just feels like more of the same. Like literally, it'll be like Sunburst meets someone and finds out that they share an interest that Starlight doesn't have, and then we literally waste an entire minute of a montage without even any dialogue of just seeing Sunburst and this other pony doing this thing while Starlight is just feeling left out. Like, and they do this several times over the course of the episode, which just makes it feel kind of boring and repetitive for me. Then we get to the climax of the episode when Starlight is trying to literally make them children again in order to play this game that she cares a lot about. But then Sunburst just doesn't really take it all that well. And I do find the fact that Starlight even considered this a good idea to be pretty interesting, as it makes it pretty clear that Starlight really idolizes and romanticizes this part of her life before Starlight left in the first place. And that does lead to some pretty interesting drama. Now, afterwards, I do think it kind of slows down again, where Starlight just runs out, and then Sunburst has to really fix a lot of the things by getting all the ponies together. And in turn, they are able to make Starlight feel a bit special. So at the end of the day, I feel like this episode could have been a bit better. However, it is dragged down by certain things that make it feel a bit repetitive and a bit boring. So I can't have it super high, but I still feel like it has enough good ideas and some interesting enough interactions and some ideas concerning Starlight that does leave it here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we have a couple episodes here that I've already talked about in previous videos. But at number 15, we do have Campfire Tales, and this episode's fine. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a pretty standard world building episode, particularly one introducing us to a couple of the pillars, namely Rockhoof, Flash Magnus, and Miss Main. And, you know, their stories are fine for the most part, and they're pretty fine on their own, but at the end of the day, I feel like this is not a super remarkable episode, and definitely one that serves more to set up the season 7 finale, which obviously I'll be getting to soon, rather than anything that can really stand on its own, in my personal opinion. It's not that this episode is bad or anything, and I don't have anything too wrong to say with it. It's just kind of there for me, and it's not really my favorite, so I do have to leave it here at number 15. Now we're moving on to number 14, and we have another episode that I've already talked about in a previous video, and here we have Marks and Recreation. And admittedly, I feel like my opinion on this episode has gone down a bit since the last time I talked about it, where I feel like the more I think about it, this episode did leave some stuff on the table for me, where obviously a lot of Rumble's concerns with not wanting a cutie mark is that it'll put him in a box, and how he wants to be a Wonderbolt, and how he's worried that he'll get a cutie mark that will obviously get in the way of that goal, and through that he decides not to try at all. But obviously the main flaw with that is that if he doesn't try at all, then he isn't going to get the Wonderbolt thing anyway, because for all he knows, he's probably going to be too scared to potentially try anything that would help him get better at flying. And yeah, we do see him flying to some degree to try to get good at it, but obviously not getting a cutie mark in that regard. But for the most part, this episode is fine. I mean, at the end of the day, Rumble is supposed to present this worldview of cutie marks not really being a good thing, sort of mirroring what Starlight did and the cutie map way back when, but obviously not having the hypocrisy that Starlight did and the power hungriness that came along with that. It's interesting seeing the pitfalls of his worldview, such as all the kids coming over and then being forced to not do anything, and obviously them finding that pretty boring. Obviously, one of the biggest moments from this episode for me is when Sweetie Belle insists that they all remain calm, only to cut to her like seeming pretty angry, and then after a moment being like, cutie marks make you special. Again, I just love that moment so much. Now, admittedly, I could do without the song. I mean, the song itself isn't that remarkable, and the resolution is just kind of whatever. I mean, we meet Thunderlane, Rumble's big brother, and he is the one to teach him the lesson of how, oh, just because you have your cutie mark doesn't mean that you can't do other things, which obviously based on other episodes, we know already. So ultimately, I find this episode just kind of alright, and while my opinion did go down slightly, I still find it a mostly enjoyable episode with a few moments thrown in here and there. So because of that, it is here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and I can see an argument for this episode being lower on the list, as it does have a bit of a faulty premise, but I actually kind of enjoy this episode, largely due to its execution. But here we have Triple Threat. And obviously I talked about this one in my Spike video from way back when, so check out my thoughts there. But the thing about this episode is, yeah, it does have a bit of a faulty premise, with Spike kind of assuming that the changelings and the dragons aren't going to get along, and through that he tries to separate Ember and Thorax at every opportunity, which isn't great, although it is kind of starting to address some of the issues that will be presented more in seasons 8 and 9, so I could take it or leave it, but still, I feel like Spike probably should have known better than to assume Ember would just hate Thorax because he's not a dragon, but it is what it is. The main reason I had this episode as high as it is, though, is the execution, which to be fair is probably more unintentional than anything else, but it does lead to some pretty funny moments here, like that shot of Spike when he sees Ember and Thorax go at it, how each of them show up in his eyes, and he's like, oh no, this is my worst fear. I mean, that moment is pretty funny. After that, we have the scene where Ember and Thorax become friends, which is pretty nice. But then immediately afterwards, we see them confront Spike, and we have that moment where Ember is trying to express herself, and she says, I feel. And then she has smoke coming out of her ears before she says mad. And then Thorax stands up for himself, and Spike is sort of just thrown to the ground by how assertive he is. It almost feels like a joke to a degree, where I guess part of the joke is Spike is overreacting to what seems like pretty mild instances of Thorax and Ember learning from each other to a degree, but it's mostly effective, for me at least. And there are some more intentional, funny bits as well, like when Ember keeps getting Twilight and Starlight mixed up, pointing out the fact that their names sound so similar. I found that moment to be pretty funny. On the whole, I do find this episode to be somewhat effective and somewhat memorable in my eyes. And yes, while some of that is unintentional, I still find this episode a bit more memorable than the last couple of episodes we talked about. And while you can definitely fault the premise here and Spike for assuming that the changelings and dragons would hate each other off the bat isn't great. I mean, I do at least acknowledge the fact that it is part of this broader trend that over the course of the remaining seasons is something that would be addressed on a more broader level. But still, you can fault Spike a bit for having that assumption in the first place. But this episode is good enough on its own, and I do enjoy it enough to have it here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and we have another episode that I've already talked about before. And here we have Forever Philly. And I still largely stand by my thoughts of it from when I talked about it in my CMC video, where I feel like the biggest issue is Sweetie Belle can be a bit unlikable at points, where it seems like she isn't even giving Rarity a chance for a lot of it, and we see Rarity trying really, really hard to connect with Sweetie Belle only to come up short. And while I do largely relate to Sweetie Belle throughout a lot of this story, again, considering the fact that I am the youngest in my family, I am kind of used to being babied, I still feel like Sweetie Belle came off as a bit mean-spirited during certain parts of it. But on the whole, I still find this a largely relatable story and one that has a somewhat satisfying conclusion, particularly that ending where Sweetie Belle finally decides to have the ice cream and they had that picture of them just having ice cream all over their face. I do like that moment. But considering that flaw of Sweetie Belle not being the most likable at certain parts, I did decide to leave this episode a bit lower here at number 12. Now we're moving on to number 11, and we are actually talking about a new episode, one that I haven't talked about before, and I kind of went back and forth with this one. There was definitely a point where this episode was inside the top 10, but after thinking about some more, I did decide to leave it out, but here we have It Isn't the Main Thing About You, and for me, there are a couple little issues with this episode. For one, I find it really weird how this episode literally comes not too long after Campfire Tales, where we heard Rarity tell the story of Miss Spain, this character who gave up her beauty in order to save the world and whatever, and then how internal beauty is what really matters. But then here in this episode, we see Rarity really struggle to accept this, and she spends a lot of this episode worried about her outside appearance more than anything else. So I did find that a little wonky. Also found the rules regarding hair creation spells to be really weird. I mean, we did see in Ghostbusters way back in season 1 that Twilight had little issue giving Spike a mustache using her magic. But then here, like, they come up with this weird rule about how all hair has to come from somewhere and you can't make something out of nothing, which obviously, considering what I just said in Ghostbusters, but also just magic rules in general, I just found that to be a really arbitrary limitation and a really weird way to keep the conflict going. So I did find that aspect to be not ideal. And then finally, I did find the whole like mix up of how Pinky and Rarity had these two different potions, and it was so obvious that they were going to get mixed up here, with Pinky getting the shampoo that Rarity was going to use there, only for Pinky to pretty much disappear for most of the episode. And it's only at the end of the episode that they wonder, hey, what happened to the shampoo after all? And then they go to Sugar Cookie Corner, and Pinky was in there the whole time, had no idea what any of the commotion was about, and she came out with all these bubbles and stuff. So I did find Pinky's absence from the story to be a little weird, for me at least. But on the whole, I did find this episode to be pretty good. I mean, I did like how a lot of the early segments was showing Rarity showing off her confidence and her exuding confidence within others, which obviously comes back later when she does come around to see that a lot of her appeal and charisma that draws people to her is her confidence more than her actual appearance. And she does ultimately own her appearance by the end of it. And I do like the outfit that she goes with there. I also like the sort of twist where it turns out that Photo Finish was taking pictures of her this whole time, like in while she was out in the town. So I guess that was something. So on the whole, I did find this to be a pretty good episode for the most part. It's just several knocks here and there in terms of, again, the magic rules, but also certain continuity stuff. And obviously Pinky not really being in this episode when I feel like she probably should have played a bigger role in it. That does lead me to leave this episode outside the top 10, but I still find this episode pretty good. So it's here at number 11. And with that, we are now inside the top 10. And as usual, it is a matter of the order here moving forward. But number 10, we actually have the very first episode of MLP that I covered on this channel. And here we have Shadowplay, the season 7 finale. Now, admittedly, I think my opinion of Shadowplay has gone up a bit since the last time I talked about it. However, I still think it is probably the weakest two-parter of the series, where a lot of it just feels unremarkable, in my opinion. I mean, yeah, we get the pillars and we get that storyline come together, again, trying to recreate what Twilight's Kingdom did and having this season-long arc, per se, come together here. But I found it way more underwhelming in this episode than in Twilight's Kingdom, where, I mean, yeah, we did get some setup here. There is some counterpart happening with each of the pillars corresponding to a main 6 character, but even then, like, it's not really that one-to-one, in my opinion, where, I mean, yeah, we get like Rock Hoof being connected to Applejack, I guess. You have Rainbow being connected to Flash Magnus, you know, like Rarity connected to Miss Main, but then Pinky's connected to Sonambula, whose whole ordeal is about not losing hope, which I guess, but then we get Fluttershy and her connection to Meadowbrook, which fine. And then we have Twilight. It has her connection to Star Swirl, which obviously Star Swirl is quite the character there. So it's not as if the connections aren't there. I mean, they're just probably not as strong in my personal opinion, and especially not compared to what we saw with the keys, where a lot of those were tied to specific storylines that the characters were getting into. Whereas here, I mean, it's really only Pinky and Fluttershy who really have an arc with them, and I guess Twilight to a degree. But the others, I mean, obviously their only connection to their pillar counterparts is just them telling a story in Campfire Tales. So I did find that a bit underwhelming. This two-part definitely has some pacing issues where the pillars don't even show up until the end of part 1, and really they're only there for part 2. A lot of part 1 is just the main 6 getting the artifact so that they can really bring these characters back to life. So, I mean, take that as well. And a lot of part 2 is also Starlight trying to convince Star Swirl to maybe redeem Stygian, but in turn, Star Swirl has this famous line, once a villain, always a villain. And admittedly, I do find that to be my favorite part of the episode, where Starlight is trying to help Star Swirl see the error of his ways, and obviously with her being a former villain herself, she takes great offense to everything Star Swirl is saying, and also Twilight refusing to really stand up for her, which culminates in that line of her saying, "It sure is a good thing your idol wasn't here when you chose to be my friend. I might have been banished to limbo too." So I did find that to be somewhat amusing, but on the whole, I did find a lot of this two-parter to be not super remarkable either. Where aside from everything I just said, Stygian isn't even that great of an antagonist, where obviously he is being set up for this redemption arc early on. And yes, it is sort of implied that he is in a similar line to Nightmare Moon and Luna in the sense that he was more so corrupted by this outside spirit than really becoming the main antagonist on his own. And obviously, we see Starlight and Twilight really help to rescue him, break him out of the Shadow Pony, and then eventually he does have his redemption there. So it's not really a two-parter that I would consider overly bad at the end of the day, outside of some pacing issues, but it's just one that I don't find very remarkable. It is one that I feel like other two-parters do better. I mean, as I said, with like Stygian being this antagonist who was corrupted and has to be redeemed. I mean, honestly, enjoy Nightmare Moon much more than Stygian and the Shadow Pony. I did find that pretty underwhelming. Again, with the pillars and the season-long arc, I feel like season 4 did that better with the keys. And in general, I find this one to just be a composite of other two-parters to the point where I feel like not too much allows it to stand on its own per se. But when compared to other episodes from season 7, it is still a two-parter. It still is elevated by the fact that it is trying to tell a somewhat larger story, and there are still plenty of moments in it that I do get some enjoyment out of. So while this does seem a bit high of a placement here, considering how much I've bashed this two-parter in previous videos I've made, I still find it relatively low compared to what it could have been, and especially considering the fact that it's the only two-parter from season 7. But with everything that I just laid out, I did decide to leave it here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and I can see some people saying this episode is a bit too high, and to be fair, I did have that debate myself. However, I don't feel like this episode is as flawed as certain other episodes we've already talked about, but here we have Fluttershy leans in, and really the only problem I have with the episode is the conflict isn't as strong per se, and there isn't really a lot of character development on Fluttershy's end. You know, it's kind of like the super speedy cider squeezy 6000 where the whole thing is Applejack didn't learn anything. Well, here we see Fluttershy kind of already being assertive throughout a lot of it. And yes, while we do I get glimpses from some episodes dealing with a similar plot of Fluttershy not really having much trouble asserting herself, she does seem to have this pretty clear vision in her head for a lot of it, and she seems pretty committed to sticking with it. And I feel like that is a slight problem because I feel like with a lot of the premise here being that the other main characters bring in these quote unquote experts to help her build her sanctuary, there could have been this moment in the episode where Fluttershy leaves her vision and does what she feels like the experts have in mind, feeling like the experts know better than she does. But then ultimately by the end coming back around, seeing that at the end of the day, she knows what she's doing. So I did feel like it lacked some tension in that regard, but still I do appreciate the effort in them having this tension between Fluttershy having a clear vision and having to deal with these experts who think they know what they're doing when in reality what they have in mind doesn't really comport to what she needs from the sanctuary. But on the whole, I still find myself liking this episode to a degree, and I feel like it's a mostly solid episode, one that doesn't really have as many issues compared to something like It Isn't the Main Thing About You or Forever Philly. And I feel like it is a bit more intentional with the effects that it gives off, unlike an episode like Triple Threat. So I feel like this is technically a more sound episode and one that I do enjoy more, which is why I do have it higher than something like a Campfire Tales. But at the end of the day, I still see the arguments, and really I could see this episode potentially dropping in a future ranking. But for right now, considering where I am with season 7 and these episodes, I feel like 9 is a good enough spot for it. Now we're moving on to number 8, and I feel like from here on in, the rest of these episodes are pretty solid and ones that I do get quite a bit of enjoyment out of. I feel like this is sort of the top tier of this list for me. But at number 8, we have the episode that I consider the least impressive in my eyes, but here we have Daring Done. And I feel like this is my favorite Daring Do episode by a decent amount in that it does tell a somewhat interesting story here, we see Daring Do having to deal with some of the consequences of her actions here, namely with the villagers being mad at her for destroying the Sonambula statue. And it does kind of remind me of Captain America Civil War, which did tell a somewhat similar story in that it presents the debate over whether collateral damage justifies doing good deeds. And considering what we know from Daring Do in season 9, it does seem that a lot of this is in pursuits that are probably a little selfish or ones that are a bit self-serving. So I do find this to be a somewhat interesting conflict, particularly in hindsight. But even within the episode, I did find it pretty good for the most part. I do like the backstory that they give for Sonambula and how she never gave up hope. And through that, it really explains why the villagers look up to her so much. And then by the end, I did find the twist to be a bit underwhelming, where it did turn out that Caballerion was a big reason why Daring Do's reputation was being ruined, where I feel like it would have been much better if the villagers did genuinely get upset at Daring Do, and it really was more Daring Do working on her own to redeem herself in the eyes of these villagers versus just Caballerion peddling this hatred. So I did find that to be a bit underwhelming, but on the whole, I still found this story to be pretty interesting, and I did find it to be one of the better episodes in terms of introducing the pillars, even though the pillar themselves did not play that big of a role in the story per se. They are more so a symbol of the actual broader conflict here and representing something that the villagers actually value. But considering everything I just said, I did find this episode pretty good, but I feel like the top 7 episodes were a bit more impressive for me, so I did have to leave it here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have another episode that I do really enjoy, but here we have Rock Solid Friendship. And to me, this is a better version of A Friend Indeed, where obviously one of the big conflicts here is Pinky being a bit too micromanagey when it comes to ensuring that Starlight and Maud become friends, where despite them having good chemistry and them really gravitating towards each other, it's through Pinky's constant intervention that really gets in the way, to the point where Maud decides to not move the Ponyville after all. And I always love the scene where Pinky tells Starlight about this after Maud has moved away, and we have that moment where Starlight calls Maud weird. Pinky has this really weird reaction where she yells "hey" in response to her calling Maud weird, which has some subtext if you ask me. But after that, we have Starlight basically calling Pinky out by saying that she kinda sort of got in the way. And then when she sees Pinky's feelings get hurt, she says, "Okay, too harsh. How about you ruined everything all the time?" I don't know. That scene was just really hilarious. And again, is part of the reason why this is a better version of A Friend Indeed, where it does call out Pinky, it does motivate Pinky to try to rectify things, but does it in a really comedic way, if you ask me. And I always love that scene. It's definitely one of my favorite scenes involving Starlight. But even before that, we do see Starlight and Maud meet for the first time. We have that backstory of Starlight meeting Maud back when she was evil, which again did seem a bit unnecessary, in that obviously it is a way of reminding Starlight of her evil past once again, but it obviously never really comes back in any meaningful way, where Pinky does have that comment about Maud contributing to Starlight's evil plans there, only for Maud to say, well, she hasn't done anything evil lately. And then from there, we get the rest of the story, where again, I feel like a lot of the strength of the episode is Starlight and Maud's relationship. They do have a good amount of chemistry here. And yes, while it may not be as blatant as something like a Trixie, where obviously Starlight and Trixie have a very similar background, I do still find Maud and Starlight to be a very interesting duo here, with them having some good passion for whatever it is that they're into, but also kind of feeling like outsiders to some degree. And in general, I find Starlight's decision to stand up to Pinky's micromanaging and overly controlling nature in this episode to be pretty fitting character development, where obviously one of Starlight's key attributes from when she was evil was her over controlling nature and her micromanaging everything. So for her to come around to see the errors of that mindset and to in turn call someone out for doing that against her does kind of show how she has grown as a character, and not really in a hypocritical way, but more so someone who has grown past these things and is no longer willing to accept that either for herself or for others. So, on the whole, I did find myself really enjoying this episode. Now, yes, I could see some people like knocking this episode to a degree, like how Pinky is still being pretty annoying here, how it does unnecessarily bring up Starlight's past. But I did find myself enjoying this episode quite a bit, and I did find it addressing a lot of those issues in a pretty positive way for me. And plus, this episode's really funny. So because of that, I did have this episode relatively high, and it's here at number 7. Now I'm moving on to number 6, and I feel like this episode's pretty close with Rock Solid Friendship. And to be fair, I feel like in a future ranking, I could see Rock Solid Friendship edging it out. But for this list, at least, I did decide to go with To Change a Changeling here. And I feel like this episode is a bit more consistent, although I do find it having a similar quirk per se with Rock Solid Friendship in that it does have a bit more weird humor that you start to see in these later seasons. Like there's that whole scene where they have that support group with the other changelings, and like Pharynx is so nasty that he ends up breaking the person who's running it. So I did find that pretty funny. You have Starlight's speech where she's trying to rally the changelings to help Pharynx after he leaves the hive. And she says, "Not because you have to, but because you choose to." And then none of them come along, or at least not immediately per se. And I know there are some issues with this episode. I know some people feel like this should have been a Spike episode, as Thorax literally told Spike back in Triple Threat about his brother, only for this to be a mostly Starlight episode here. But honestly, I didn't mind that too much. I mean, Starlight already had a relationship with Thorax from To and Back Again, so I feel like we really could have done with either of them here. And considering this episode is largely about a redemption arc, that does tie it more to that two-parter than to Triple Threat per se. I am ultimately fine with this being a Starlight episode and Spike not really being that big of a factor here. But I still find this to be a pretty solid episode. You know, like Pharynx is a pretty, like basic character, but one who's still pretty entertaining to see throughout a lot of it. We get that backstory towards the end of how Pharynx always protected Thorax, which is pretty good. And overall, I do feel like this was a pretty interesting follow-up to Where I'm Back Again, where we see the after effects of all the changelings being reformed here. And it is pretty funny seeing how a lot of the changelings now are kind of Milkwood host, and like they are kind of funny with how soft spoken they are and how nice they are. And again, that whole group support scene is really funny in my opinion. But I do feel like the top 5 episodes edge it out, definitely provide more memorable moments for me. So I did leave it here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have a pretty notable episode to get through here. And here we have Celestial Advice, the season 7 premiere, and the only premiere slash finale episode to only be a one-parter. And this is a pretty solid episode in my opinion. It's obviously a direct follow-up to Where I'm Back Again, where Celestia is awarding Starlight, Trixie, Thorax, and Discord medals for their accomplishments, only for Twilight to then worry about Starlight's future. And this episode does kind of suffer from Discord being at his usual antics of trying to teach people a lesson here, this time showing Twilight that she needs to have Starlight advance to some degree beyond just being her student. And admittedly, I do find this to be one of the more justified cases for Discord being Discord, where I don't love how he just tells everyone that Twilight has a big announcement, putting all this pressure on her to actually have something to present. But just the initial idea of him like telling Twilight that she should probably do something for Starlight beyond just giving her a medal is something at least. And it does kickstart the story where we do get some pretty memorable moments. Twilight has her usual Twilight stick of like worrying about what Starlight would do if she sent her on her own. And we do have some pretty amusing segments of Starlight like really getting into trouble, like being with Ember and being like totally when asked when she wants to do some lava surfing, which is pretty funny. There's obviously the other storyline of her potentially like doing some more magic and getting herself into a black hole. That was a pretty morbid moment there. And then she eventually like spills this all to Celestia, who then in turn just laughs it off. And I always love how it cuts to commercial break when Celestia starts laughing, and it makes it seem like it's going to be some really bad thing. But then immediately Celestia clarifies that, oh, Twilight, I was just like you once. And we had that whole backstory of her being just as antsy with sending Twilight off, and how she really waited until the last possible moment to send Twilight to Ponyville in order to save the world from Nightmare Moon. So I do find that backstory to be pretty nice. And from that, we do eventually get to Twilight's speech where she tells Starlight that she's graduating. And we had that moment of Starlight being very confused and her not really knowing what to do and how she doesn't really want to leave. And she tells Starlight this, and Twilight is like, oh, that's good because I don't want you to leave either. And then she gives her gift, her mirror, which was alluded to at the beginning, where Twilight did sneak into her room to measure out the wall so that the mirror will be the right size. And I do like the mirror itself. It has some pretty nice callbacks in it, some pretty nice pictures during season 5 and season 6. So I do find that pretty nice. So on the whole, I do find this episode to be pretty solid and a pretty good season premiere, despite it only being a one-parter. But I do feel like the top 4 episodes are a bit more interesting and have a bit more going for them. So I do have to leave this here at number 5. Now I'm moving on to number 4, and this episode is kind of similar to Celestial Vice in that I view them as being on roughly similar ground, but here we have a health of information, and this was a pretty compelling story for me. Now, I'm sure some people will take fault with the message to a degree, where obviously Fluttershy probably should not have slowed down to get this cure, as Zecora was literally sick and she had a very limited amount of time to stop the spread of the swamp fever. And yeah, while I do get it, I mean, we do see by the end that she was able to get other people involved, or at least that was the intent here, to get Twilight and Cattail involved so that they could also help with the cure, that so that she isn't shouldering this all by herself. But that is just it. It does lead to this very compelling story where, despite Fluttershy being assertive and her sticking with the more assertive route that her character arc has led to, she still shoulders a tremendous amount of guilt over like getting Zecora sick in the first place, and her feeling like it is her sole duty to ensure that like she is able to find this cure in time. And yeah, while it's probably not ideal that she is still the one who has to find it by the end, where she obviously gets knocked out, sleeps for 3 days, and then is the one who finds the mask that allows her to get the honey to get the cure after Twilight and Cattail literally tried and failed in her absence to do so. I mean, it does kind of fall to a degree there, but I still kind of appreciate what they were going for. But it's really Fluttershy that makes this episode for me, where again, she is shouldering all this guilt, but is still trying very hard to ensure that she gets this cure and saves Zecora's life on a very tight schedule, but all while the whole message being how she is running herself ragged in the process. So I do see some of the faults with this episode in that Fluttershy probably didn't have time to take care of herself given the premise, but I still appreciate what they were going for. And this is a very solid episode for me, and again, one of the better episodes to introduce like a pillar here. But I do feel like the top 3 episodes top it for me and are very complete episodes and don't really have the same issues that this episode and certain other episodes we talked about earlier fall into. So because of that, I do have it here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and we're at the point now where 2 of the 3 episodes left here to talk about are ones that I have already covered in a previous video. Mind you, I feel like number 3 is still a bit of an outlier, especially given its subject matter, but here we have Discordant Harmony, the Discord episode for this season. And as I talked about in my Discord episode ranking, this is probably one of the best Discord episodes out there. I mean, probably outside Twilight's Kingdom, which even then, that's more of a general episode. If we're strictly talking about focus episodes for Discord, this is easily the best focus episode for Discord, in that his antics are essentially harmless here. I mean, he is someone who is trying so hard to be a normie. And yes, while this episode does end by basically trying to justify his weirdness here, I mean, it doesn't indicate per se that he has to resort to some of his usual antics. And I do love how throughout this entire episode, he is entirely motivated by trying to make Fluttershy approve of him. And him trying to make sure that his house is prepared in a way so that Fluttershy isn't freaked out by it. And I do love a lot of the scenes early on where he is trying to get the house ready. He goes to the party store and gets some advice from Pinky about making sure that he has all the advice. And Pinky runs up to the counter and really shouts, "Excuse me, where can I find the glowing flying self-folding napkins?" I found that moment pretty memorable as well. And we eventually get to the tea party where he really tries super hard to be this Mr. Rogers figure, someone who's really boring, very bland, and it really is so effective that not only does Fluttershy find it all pretty boring, but he literally starts to die. Literally saying that Discord needs to be his weird self or else he will die and fade from existence. And that led to a pretty interesting climax where we see him really let loose and Fluttershy contributing to it. Like it's almost like they're both kind of letting themselves go and just making a mess out of everything just to embrace the weirdness and make sure that Discord returns to his usual self. And this episode accomplishes two things in my opinion. One, it's relatively lighthearted for the most part and pretty harmless, which does lead to some pretty good comedy, particularly with Discord early on and doing the preparations, but it's also incredibly wholesome in that, again, Discord is doing all of this normal stuff in order to please Fluttershy, to make her approve of him, to make her happy. And even at the end, when Fluttershy is getting Discord to be weird, like it's all her saying that she always knew what he was and that she wants him to be weird. She wants him to be himself. And in turn, he comes around to embracing himself. So it is a pretty wholesome episode and one that's relatively lighthearted, but one that is still very entertaining to watch. As I said, this is easily the best Discord episode, which I do think is saying a lot considering I don't really like Discord all that much. And in general, this is a very strong episode. But I feel like the top two, while not as lighthearted, still hit some pretty heavy punches for me. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I feel like this one may be a bit controversial, and as I know there are people who will take some issue with this episode, but I just love it a lot. And it's actually one that I've talked about before, and here we have a royal problem. Now, I get some of the complaints with this episode in that it seems to do things that have been done in previous episodes and probably things that the characters have moved past. I mean, we see Starlight like contributing to the conflict here by using magic to try to solve her problems and switching Celestia and Luna's cutie marks, like showing how she didn't learn her lesson from every little thing she does. And we also have Twilight micromanaging Starlight here, like spying on her, making sure she's doing all the right things and really not trusting her at all to make the correct decisions, like which calls into question whether she learned anything from No Second Prances here. However, I don't take as much issue with those things, mainly because of Celestia and Luna here. I mean, I feel like a big reason why these lapses here are justified is that we see through this episode that other ponies kind of view like Celestia and Luna as these really intimidating figures. I mean, they are the leaders of an entire country, and through that, their presence causes other ponies to behave differently than they might usually do so. Like Twilight really sees Celestia and Luna as these authority figures, and when they are involved, she really wants to make sure that Starlight is doing the right thing, as she knows that there can be some serious repercussions for screwing up. We actually see this to a degree in Forgotten Friendship, like an Equestria Girls special, where Twilight is able to convince Sunset to come over to Equestria so that she can formally apologize to Celestia. But even then, like, we see Twilight get really nervous when she approaches the throne room with Sunset by her side. And when Sunset decides to apologize using her own words, like Twilight gets really nervous at the first sight of her potentially saying something out of turn, per se. So we obviously know from experience that Twilight at least behaves differently here. And considering that a lot of this episode is intended to have the characters sort of realize that Celestia and Luna aren't perfect, that they are just as pony-ish as the others and are prone to very pony limitations, I feel like it's pretty justified here to see these characters sort of behave differently than they might otherwise. And with Starlight here, I mean, she's obviously pretty nervous in front of Celestia and Luna to the point where she could potentially like not rely as much upon the confidence or certain other characteristics that she has gotten through her character development here, which again allows her to go back on her old ways to a degree. And we do see her immediately see the error of her ways when she does cast a spell and she is terrified at all the punishment that she could get for doing this. And she tries very nervously to explain it, which I do find pretty interesting. But circling back now to the main premise, we do see Celestia and Luna have this pretty interesting focus episode here of them not really seeing eye to eye, which does make you question like how long this has been going on. And I know some people may take fault with the fact that it took us until season 7 to get a focus episode like this, but I don't really mind it too much, and I'm actually glad that we got it here as opposed to, well, never. And it is interesting seeing some of the dynamics here come into play, particularly with Luna still feeling like Celestia is more worshipped than her, while Celestia in turn feels like Luna has a relatively easy job, while she has to really be the PR person for the Royal Sisters here. And it's interesting seeing the, I guess, comedy of them trying to go about like their each other's jobs. I mean, we see Luna having to take that picture for all the schoolfuls, and then her failing to smile results in them not getting their money for their field trip, which did seem a bit harsh. I mean, it's a bit harsh that Luna was the reason that they didn't get their money, but it's interesting seeing how the episode takes that and really makes it a whole plot point where Luna keeps focusing on it over and over again, how she keeps feeling bad for screwing up, but she has to keep moving forward. And then when she has her nightmare towards the end, that just keeps coming back. So I did find that element of it to be pretty interesting. We then get Celestia getting corrupted and turned into Daybreaker here, and then them having their fight with against Nightmare Moon. That's pretty good. We have Twilight coming back in Starlight's nightmare about how Starlight feels bad and how she'll never trust her god again. Like a lot of stuff coming in this climax, which does make it very interesting. Just seeing this, all this mess coming together is just really fascinating to watch. And again, I do understand the complaints of how a lot of this feels repetitive, but I do justify it to a degree because the whole point of this episode is to highlight that Celestia and Luna maybe aren't as like perfect as their status would indicate. And it's sort of about breaking down those barriers to a degree. So I do find myself justifying it in that we do see these characters kind of tiptoeing about that issue. And plus, it's just a really entertaining episode for me. And I do walk away from this being like, this is one of the best Starlight episodes out there and one of the best episodes in the entire series, despite what people may say about it. However, I do feel like one episode tops it to a degree. One episode that I feel like is probably more perfect than A World of Problem and doesn't have the same potential pitfalls that other people have attributed to it. So because of that, I do have to leave it here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the best episode of MLP Season 7 should be pretty obvious at this point, and it's a widely loved episode of the series, but here we have The Perfect Pair. Now, I actually kind of debated with myself over whether this really was the best, as I feel like this episode is obviously pretty well loved by the fandom, and on some level it is an event episode. I mean, while it's not necessarily a holiday or a musical episode per se, or obviously a two-parter, it is considered a special episode. It's obviously the one that gets into the backstory of Applejack's parents and really hammering home the fact that they're dead, which at this point we all knew. And it does have some special guests as well, like William Shatner and stuff like that. So it is still technically a special episode. But how much of that factors into it being seen as the best episode? And on another level, it is a mostly standard story. I mean, it is your typical Romeo and Juliet story of these star-crossed lovers and them eventually eloping and really cutting the tie, at least with the pairs. But I do find this episode to be pretty well executed, and that's really what sold it to me as the best episode, in that future rewatches really highlight just how well the story is told, where we see the Apple siblings go from person to person to get pieces of the story, and we see them going to Mrs. Cake and to Mayor and to their father's friend from growing up, and eventually to Grandpa Pear, to just piece together this story. And I find that to be pretty interesting. And obviously seeing like each of their reactions to the story as it's being delivered. And it doesn't feel too contrived, where usually what they'll have is one person just telling the entire story with like occasional cuts here and there. But here, by having multiple people telling the story, it obviously justifies it to a degree, in that obviously they're getting different sides of it. They're not just relying on one person, but it also makes the breaks that allow for the reactions to be a bit more natural, in that they're obviously getting the whole story, but well, the whole story doesn't take up the whole episode, and they had to eventually go to someone else. So I do find that pretty good. We obviously get the song here, which is pretty strong, if you ask me. Now, I actually keep on thinking that the song is called The Perfect Pair, when in reality it's called You're in My Head Like a Catchy Song. But it is a pretty effective song for me, and it does lead into the rest of the story, where we see them getting married. We have Pear Butter basically cutting off her father from her life, which was something we get confirmation as well that Mare did in fact used to have a pink mane, but has been dyeing it, so take that as you will. And this episode, again, tells a pretty complete story. Now, admittedly, the story itself isn't really enough to catapult it to number one. It really does come down to the execution and the way in which it communicates a story in a pretty wholesome but also a pretty natural way, where it does effectively capture so many different angles of the story, like between us learning the story, getting the confirmation that the parents are dead. Although even then, we don't actually get an explanation for how they died or when they died, but that's not too important. We get different characters involved. We get obviously Granny Smith's reaction as well. We get the whole reaction to Applejack finding out that she is half pear, so take that as you will. And in hindsight, it does also kind of explain certain attributes to their characters, such as why the parents weren't there even as early as the flashbacks and Where the Apple Lies. It does recontextualize episodes like Some Pony to Watch Over Me, where Applejack was obviously being a bit overprotective as well. So I do find this episode to be pretty strong, and one that largely lives up to its billing. And considering the rest of the field here, considering the fact that I don't really find there to be too many issues with the episode, other than the story maybe not being the most original in the world, but I do find it to be pretty effective and definitely one of the best ones in the entire series. So because of that, I do have it here at number one. And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, obviously, I'll be back pretty soon to do the season 8 episode ranking, so stay tuned for that. I do have other content coming out on this channel pretty soon, particularly with the G5 Make Your Mark series coming out soon. I do plan to have some coverage for that, so stay tuned for that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join in the description. A lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that's the video. See ya.